On January 30th, 2026, the United States Department of Justice did something unprecedented. They released to the public over 3.5 million pages of investigative documents, more than 2,000 videos, nearly 200,000 images, all related to one man, Jeffrey Epstein. This wasn't just another document dump. This was the culmination of decades of secrecy, political pressure, survivor advocacy, and public demand for answers. The Epstein Files. A name that has become synonymous with power, abuse, conspiracy theories, and one of the darkest scandals in modern American history. But what exactly are these files? Who's in them? And perhaps most importantly, what do they actually reveal? I'm going to take you through this story from beginning to end, not the sensational headlines, not the conspiracy theories, but the documented facts, what we know, what we don't, and why this matters. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand exactly what the Epstein Files are, who ran the operations that created them, what's been released, what's still hidden, and why this case continues to shake the foundations of power around the world. This is the complete story of the Epstein Files. Who was Jeffrey Epstein? Before we dive into the files themselves, we need to understand the man at the center of this story. Jeffrey Epstein was an American financier who built his wealth and influence through mysterious means that, to this day, remain partially unexplained. He cultivated relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world: presidents, princes, billionaires, scientists, and celebrities. But behind this facade of elite networking and philanthropic donations lurked something far darker. In 2008, Epstein was convicted in Florida for soliciting prostitution from a minor. He served just 13 months in a county jail under a controversial plea deal that has been called one of the most lenient sentences for a sex offender in American legal history. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. In July 2019, federal prosecutors in New York arrested Epstein again, this time on charges of sex trafficking of minors. The indictment alleged that between 2002 and 2005, Epstein ran a vast trafficking network from his properties in Manhattan and Palm Beach, recruiting dozens of underage girls. He never stood trial. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The official cause, suicide by hanging. The reaction, widespread skepticism, conspiracy theories, and demands for answers that continue to this day. But Epstein didn't act alone. In 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime associate and alleged accomplice, was convicted on 5 counts related to recruiting and grooming underage girls for abuse. She's currently serving a 20-year federal prison sentence. These convictions, these investigations, these survivors' testimonies generated millions of pages of evidence. And for years, most of it remained locked away in government files, until now. The question everyone has been asking is simple but profound. What exactly did Jeffrey Epstein do? Who helped him? And who knew about it? The Epstein Files were supposed to answer these questions. But as we'll discover, what they reveal is as significant as what they continue to hide. So let's answer the first critical question. What exactly are the Epstein Files? The term Epstein Files doesn't refer to a single document or a secret list. Instead, it's a collective term for the massive trove of investigative materials gathered by federal law enforcement during multiple criminal investigations into Jeffrey Epstein and his network. According to the Department of Justice, these files were collected from 5 primary sources. First, the Florida case against Epstein, the 2008 prosecution that resulted in that controversial plea deal. Second, the New York case against Epstein, the 2019 federal sex trafficking charges. Third, the New York case against Ghislaine Maxwell, her recruitment and grooming trial. Fourth, investigations into Epstein's death in federal custody. And fifth, multiple FBI investigations spanning years, along with an Office of Inspector General investigation into the circumstances of Epstein's death. What's actually in these files? Court documents, indictments, depositions, witness statements, legal motions, emails and correspondence, communications between Epstein and various associates, business partners, and acquaintances, financial records, wire transfers, bank statements, real estate transactions, flight logs, records from Epstein's private jets, including passenger manifests, phone records, call logs, and contact information from seized devices, photographs and videos, surveillance footage, social photographs, and digital media seized from Epstein's properties, FBI investigative reports, agent notes, interview summaries, evidence analyses. The scale is staggering. The Department of Justice initially identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages. From that massive collection, they released approximately 3.5 million pages to the public, along with over 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. That means roughly half of the identified materials were withheld, a fact that has generated enormous controversy and demands for greater transparency. But why are these files significant? Because they document not just Epstein's crimes, but his connections, the powerful people who intersected with his world, the institutions that may have enabled him, and potentially evidence of other wrongdoing that extends far beyond what Epstein and Maxwell were convicted of. These aren't just legal documents, they're a map of power, influence, and alleged complicity at the highest levels of society. They show us how Epstein operated, who was in his orbit, and how someone with his history could continue to move freely among the elite for so long. But understanding what's in the files requires understanding how they came to be released at all, because that story is almost as remarkable as the contents themselves. For years, survivors of Epstein's abuse, their attorneys, lawmakers, and the public demanded the release of these files, but the government resisted. Why? Officials cited various reasons: ongoing investigations, victim privacy, national security concerns, attorney-client privilege. And to be fair, some of these concerns were legitimate. Protecting victim identities is crucial, but critics argued the government was using these justifications to shield powerful people from embarrassment or scrutiny. The pressure kept building. Then in November 2025, Congress acted. The House of Representatives voted on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a bill requiring the Department of Justice to release all documents, files, records, videos, and images related to the investigations and prosecutions of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. The vote was stunning, 427 to 1. Only one member of Congress voted against it, Representative Clay Higgins of Louisiana, who argued the bill risked exposing witnesses and uninvolved Americans without proper safeguards. The next day, the Senate passed the bill by unanimous consent. No debate, no opposition. On November 19, 2025, President Donald Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law. The law gave the Attorney General 30 days to begin releasing the documents, meaning a deadline of December 19, 2025. That deadline passed. The government missed it by over 40 days, sparking outrage and accusations of deliberate delay. Finally, on January 30th, 2026, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who had previously served as Trump's personal defense attorney, held a press conference announcing the release. More than 500 attorneys and reviewers from the department contributed to this effort, Blanche stated. He emphasized that the DOJ had erred on the side of over-collecting materials and that notable individuals and politicians were not redacted. The files went live on a dedicated Department of Justice website, and the world started reading. But almost immediately, problems emerged. Survivors and their attorneys began noticing something deeply troubling. Despite assurances that victim identities would be protected, names of survivors were left unredacted in numerous documents. Gloria Allred, a prominent attorney representing 27 Epstein survivors, publicly stated the DOJ had failed to redact the names of her clients, calling it devastating. The very people the files were supposed to protect were being re-victimized by their release. This wasn't just a bureaucratic error, it was a catastrophic breach of privacy that re-traumatized survivors and raised serious questions about the competence and intentions of those managing the release. This is the question everyone wants answered. Who's in the files? But before we go through the names, we need to establish something critical, a principle that responsible journalism requires. Appearing in the Epstein files does not mean someone committed a crime. Let me repeat that. Being mentioned in an email, appearing in a photograph, or showing up in flight logs does not automatically equal guilt, participation in trafficking, or even knowledge of Epstein's crimes. Some people had minimal professional interactions. Some socialized with Epstein before his crimes became public. Some may have been manipulated or deceived by him. And yes, some may have known more than they've admitted. Context matters. Evidence matters. And in most cases involving people named in these files, there are no criminal charges. With that crucial disclaimer established, let's look at who appears in the 2026 release. Elon Musk. The Tesla and SpaceX CEO exchanged emails with Epstein in 2012 and 2013. In one message, Epstein asked Musk, "How many people will you be for the Helita Island?" An apparent reference to Epstein's private island. Musk has stated he had very little correspondence with Epstein, declined the island invitation, and called the files release a distraction. No allegations of wrongdoing have been made, and no charges filed. Bill Gates. The Microsoft founder appears extensively. Notes in the files suggest Epstein believed Gates engaged in extramarital affairs and may have tried to leverage that information. Gates's representatives have called the claims false. Gates has previously acknowledged meeting with Epstein multiple times to discuss philanthropy, a decision he's since called a huge mistake. The files reveal that Epstein may have seen Gates as someone whose reputation could be exploited, though no evidence of criminal activity has emerged. Donald Trump. The current president appears in multiple documents. The DOJ specifically noted that some materials included untrue and sensationalist claims against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. Deputy Attorney General Blanche stated, "We did not protect President Trump or anybody in the release process. Trump has long maintained he banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago years before Epstein's arrest, though photographs and documents show they socialized in earlier decades." The files contain both legitimate documentation of their past association and what the DOJ acknowledges as false accusations submitted during the heat of a presidential campaign. Howard Lutnick. Trump's Commerce Secretary nominee appears in correspondence. No wrongdoing has been alleged. Steve Tisch. The New York Giants co-owner and film producer appears in the files. No allegations or charges. These names demonstrate how wide Epstein's network extended into business, technology, and entertainment circles. Former Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, who was stripped of his royal titles, appears extensively. Photographs show him at various Epstein properties. Andrew has faced civil litigation from Virginia Giuffre, who accused him of sexual abuse, allegations he has denied. He settled that lawsuit in 2022 without admitting wrongdoing. Following the January 2026 release, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer publicly stated Andrew should testify before the US Congress about his dealings with Epstein. The files contain numerous images and documents that have intensified calls for Andrew to answer questions under oath about what he knew and what he witnessed. Peter Mandelson, the former UK Labour politician and recent British ambassador to the United States, appears in the files. Documents suggest Epstein may have sent money to accounts linked to Mandelson. On February the 2nd, 2026, just days after the release, Mandelson resigned from the Labour Party, stating he did not wish to cause further embarrassment. He has denied any wrongdoing, but clearly felt the political pressure was too great to remain in his position. Bill Clinton, the former president, appears in numerous documents. Flight logs show Clinton flew on Epstein's private jet multiple times, including international trips. When questioned in a 2016 deposition, Epstein invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked about Clinton. Clinton's representatives have stated he knew nothing of Epstein's crimes and took trips related to his foundation's humanitarian work. The files don't prove criminal activity, but do show a relationship far more extensive than Clinton had previously acknowledged publicly. Miroslav Lajčák, Slovakia's national security advisor, appears in emails discussing girls and diplomacy with Epstein. On February 1st, 2026, Lajčák resigned from his position, denying any wrongdoing but acknowledging the correspondence looked inappropriate. His resignation demonstrates the international political fallout from these files, extending far beyond American borders. These are just some of the names. The files contain hundreds more. Scientists, academics, business executives, socialites, and others who intersected with Epstein's world in various ways. Deputy Attorney General Blanche was asked directly whether the newly released photos and documents provide enough evidence to prosecute anyone. His answer, no. The latest drop of documents, Blanche stated, do not contain sufficient evidence to bring charges. This is a crucial point. Despite the enormous volume of material, despite the famous names, despite years of investigation, prosecutors say there isn't enough in these files to charge anyone beyond Epstein and Maxwell themselves. One of the most persistent questions about the Epstein files is this. Is there a client list? You've probably seen the rumors online. Claims that there's a secret list of everyone who paid Epstein for trafficked victims. Allegations that powerful people are being protected because their names would appear on this list. But is it real? The short answer is there is no single client list in the way people imagine it. Let me explain what does exist and what doesn't. What we do have is Epstein's Black Book, a contact directory seized from his properties containing over 1,000 names. This book includes phone numbers and addresses of celebrities, politicians, scientists, and other prominent figures. But being in someone's contact book doesn't mean you're a client of their criminal enterprise. It means Epstein had your phone number. The Black Book is essentially Epstein's Rolodex, not a list of co-conspirators. We also have flight logs from Epstein's private planes, often called the Lolita Express. These logs show who flew on Epstein's jets and when. Some of these flights included minors who were being trafficked. Others were legitimate business trips or humanitarian missions with no connection to Epstein's crimes. The flight logs are evidence, but they're not a client list. They're transportation records that require context and corroborating evidence to mean anything in a legal sense. The files also contain financial records showing wire transfers, payments, and transactions. Some of these involve payments to victims, others involve legitimate business dealings. Forensic accountants and investigators have combed through these records looking for patterns of payment that would indicate criminal activity. But there's no smoking gun document titled People Who Paid for Trafficked Minors. What we don't have is a list that Epstein maintained of people who participated in his trafficking operation. If such a list existed, prosecutors would have used it to bring charges. The FBI had full access to everything seized from Epstein's properties: computers, hard drives, safes, filing cabinets. They had years to analyze this material, and yet, beyond Maxwell, no one else has been charged. This doesn't mean no one else was involved. It means the evidence in these files, at least as prosecutors have evaluated it, isn't sufficient to prove criminal activity beyond a reasonable doubt in court. The absence of a client list doesn't mean Epstein acted alone. It means his operation was either carefully structured to protect his associates, or the evidence needed to prove their involvement hasn't been found, or both. The myth of the client list serves a purpose for conspiracy theorists. It suggests that somewhere in a vault or on a server, there's a document that would instantly expose dozens or hundreds of powerful people. The reality is messier and more complex. The files show a network of connections, some innocent, some suspicious, many ambiguous. They show that Epstein had access to powerful people, but proving those people knew about or participated in his crimes requires more than just an email or a photograph. This is why the DOJ's Deputy Attorney General stated clearly, the files don't provide grounds for new prosecutions. The list people are looking for in the form they imagine it doesn't exist. What exists is millions of pages of material that show Epstein's world in detail, but fall short of the smoking gun many hoped would emerge. Have the Epstein Files been fully released yet? This is one of the most contentious questions surrounding the January 2026 disclosure. The answer is complicated and deeply controversial. Officially, the Department of Justice says they have complied with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. They released 3.5 million pages, over 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stated this represents full compliance with the law, but critics, including Democratic lawmakers and survivors advocates, strongly disagree. Here's why there's so much controversy. The DOJ initially identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages. They released approximately 3.5 million. That means roughly 2.5 to 3 million pages were withheld. The government says the withheld materials fall into 4 categories. First, duplicate documents between the Southern District of New York and Southern District of Florida investigations. Second, materials withheld under privilege, including attorney-client privilege and deliberative process privilege. Third, materials withheld based on exceptions under the Act, primarily depictions of violence and abuse. Fourth, items completely unrelated to the Epstein or Maxwell cases that were swept up in the broad collection effort. On the surface, these explanations sound reasonable. You don't need to release the same document twice if it appears in multiple case files. Protecting attorney-client privilege is a fundamental legal principle. Not releasing images that depict abuse is ethical and protects victims, and releasing materials completely unrelated to Epstein makes no sense. But critics argue these categories are being used too broadly, potentially shielding documents that should be public. Representative Jamie Raskin, the ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, sent a letter to Deputy Attorney General Blanche on January 31st, 2026, requesting an urgent review of the unredacted files still in DOJ possession. Raskin pointed out that the DOJ claimed to have identified 6 million pages, but only released about half. He asked for transparency about what criteria were used to withhold the other half and whether those decisions were made properly. Other members of Congress have echoed these concerns, suggesting that the 50% withholding rate is suspiciously high. Then there's the redaction issue. Even within the 3.5 million pages that were released, heavy redactions appear throughout. Names are blacked out. Entire paragraphs are removed. In some cases, whole pages are redacted except for a few words. The government says these redactions are necessary to protect ongoing investigations, victim privacy, and national security. But when you see page after page with large black boxes covering the text, it's hard not to wonder what's being hidden and why. Making matters worse, the redaction process was deeply flawed. Remember, despite promises to protect victim identities, survivors' names were left exposed in numerous documents. If the DOJ couldn't even get that fundamental protection right, what else did they get wrong? Were documents that should have been released instead withheld? Were redactions applied to protect reputations rather than legitimate interests? We simply don't know, and that uncertainty fuels suspicion. The DOJ has stated this January 2026 release represents the final batch. They don't plan to release more files, but survivors' advocates and lawmakers are pushing back. They want independent review of what's been withheld. They want clearer explanations of redaction decisions. And they want assurance that powerful people aren't being protected at the expense of transparency and justice. So to directly answer the question, no, the Epstein Files have not been fully released. Approximately half of the identified materials remain in government hands, and even what has been released is heavily redacted. Whether those withholdings and redactions are justified or whether they represent a cover-up depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain, the fight over full transparency is far from over. Are there videos and images in the Epstein Files? Yes, and this aspect of the release has been particularly significant and disturbing. The January 2026 release included over 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. This multimedia evidence provides a visual dimension to Epstein's world that text documents alone could never convey. But what exactly is in these videos and images, and what do they show? First, let's be clear about what's not in the public release. The Department of Justice explicitly stated they withheld materials that depict violence or abuse. This is appropriate and necessary. Releasing images of exploitation would re-victimize survivors and potentially violate federal laws against distributing such material. So the videos and images that were released fall into different categories. Many of the images are social photographs. These show Epstein at parties, events, and gatherings with various prominent figures. Some are seemingly innocent, people posing for photos at charitable events or social functions. Others are more problematic, images showing Epstein with young women in private settings on his private island or at his various properties. These images don't necessarily depict crimes, but they provide context about Epstein's lifestyle and the access he had to young women. The videos include surveillance footage from Epstein's properties. Security cameras captured comings and goings at his Manhattan mansion, his Palm Beach estate, and other locations. Some of this footage has been used to corroborate witness testimony about who visited Epstein and when. Other footage shows the lavish lifestyle Epstein maintained with private jets, yachts, and opulent residences. There's also video of Epstein himself being deposed and questioned. These deposition videos are particularly revealing because they show Epstein's demeanor when confronted with allegations. In multiple instances, Epstein invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer questions about his relationships with various prominent people, including Bill Clinton. Watching Epstein repeatedly take the Fifth provides a chilling glimpse into his legal strategy and his awareness that truthful answers could incriminate him. Some images are of documents and evidence. Photographs of Epstein's offices show walls covered with photos of famous people, creating what some have described as a shrine to his connections with the powerful. Other images show the interior of his properties, revealing the luxury in which he lived and the spaces where crimes occurred. Then there are the more disturbing categories. Images showing Epstein with young women in casual settings. Photos from his island showing groups of people, some of whom appear very young. While these images may not depict abuse directly, they illustrate the environment Epstein created and the access he had to vulnerable individuals. The DOJ also noted something important. Some of the images, documents, and videos in the release may be fake or falsely submitted. Everything that was sent to the FBI by the public was included in the production, meaning unverified tips, hoaxes, and false accusations are mixed in with legitimate evidence. This creates a challenge for anyone trying to analyze the material. How do you separate real evidence from fabrications? The DOJ specifically mentioned that some sensationalist claims against President Trump were submitted right before the 2020 election and are unfounded. This raises questions about other material in the files. What else might be false? The multimedia evidence also includes cell phone data and digital images recovered from devices seized from Epstein and his associates. Forensic analysis of these devices revealed photos, videos, and messages that help map out Epstein's network and activities. But again, much of this material remains classified or redacted, particularly anything that might identify victims or depict abuse. For researchers, journalists, and the public trying to understand what happened, these videos and images are invaluable. They provide visual confirmation of relationships that might otherwise be denied. They show the scale of Epstein's operation and the lifestyle his wealth enabled, but they also highlight the limitations of what's been released. The most damning visual evidence, if it exists, remains hidden behind legal restrictions and redactions. What we're seeing is a curated version of Epstein's world, sanitized to remove the most disturbing content but still revealing enough to shock. What role did Donald Trump play in the Epstein Files saga? This question has multiple dimensions. Trump's personal history with Epstein, his administration's handling of the files, and the political implications of both. Let's examine each aspect systematically. Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein moved in the same elite social circles for decades. Both were wealthy fixtures of New York and Palm Beach society. Photographs from the 1980s and 1990s show them together at parties and events. Trump himself acknowledged in a 2002 New York Magazine profile that he'd known Epstein for 15 years and called him a terrific guy. Trump added, "It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." That quote has haunted Trump throughout the Epstein scandal. Critics point to it as evidence Trump knew about Epstein's predatory behavior. Trump supporters argue it was an offhand comment that didn't mean Trump knew Epstein was committing crimes. The truth likely lies in complexity. People in their social circle knew Epstein surrounded himself with young women, but whether they knew those women were being trafficked or abused is a different question. Trump has stated he banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago after learning Epstein hit on the teenage daughter of a club member. Trump's team says this happened in the early 2000s, well before Epstein's first arrest. If true, this suggests Trump distanced himself from Epstein when inappropriate behavior became apparent. But critics note that flight logs and social records show the two maintained at least some contact into the 2000s. Now let's talk about Trump's role in the file release itself. When Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act in November 2025, Trump initially resisted. He expressed concerns about privacy, ongoing investigations, and the potential for false information to be released. But facing overwhelming bipartisan support, 427-1 in the House, and unanimous consent in the Senate, Trump signed the bill into law. However, the Trump administration's Department of Justice then missed the 30-day deadline by over 40 days, releasing the files on January 30th, 2026, instead of the required December 19th, 2025. Critics accuse the administration of deliberately delaying to bury bad news or to heavily redact materials. The administration argued the delay was necessary to properly review millions of pages and protect victim privacy. When Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, Trump's former personal attorney, announced the release, he addressed Trump's involvement directly. "We did not protect President Trump or anybody," Blanche stated. He noted that some documents in the files contained untrue and sensationalist claims against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. Blanche called these claims unfounded and false and suggested they were politically motivated hit jobs that, if they had any credibility, certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already. This statement reveals the complexity of Trump's position. On one hand, the administration is saying they didn't shield Trump from being in the files. His name appears. His past relationship with Epstein is documented. On the other hand, they're framing some of the allegations against Trump as political fabrications, attempts to smear him during an election. This leaves the public to sort through which Trump-related materials are legitimate historical record and which are false accusations. Trump himself has made relatively few public statements about the January 2026 release. He's maintained his long-standing position. He knew Epstein socially, banned him from Mar-a-Lago when inappropriate behavior came to light and had nothing to do with Epstein's crimes. Trump has called for everyone involved in trafficking to be held accountable while insisting he wasn't involved. The political implications are significant. Trump's opponents see the files as evidence of a troubling relationship with a convicted sex offender and question why Trump socialized with Epstein for so long. Trump's supporters see the release as vindication, arguing that if there was real evidence of Trump's involvement in crimes, it would have been used against him already. The fact that no charges have been brought, they argue, proves Trump's innocence. What the files actually show regarding Trump is a historical association with Epstein during the decades before Epstein's crimes became public, some photographs and social interactions, and unverified accusations that even the DOJ acknowledges are likely false. It's evidence of a past relationship that Trump now calls a mistake, but it's not evidence of criminal activity. However, the controversy surrounding the delayed release, the heavy redactions, and Trump's former attorney being the one to announce the disclosure has left many questioning whether full transparency has been achieved. Will more Epstein files be released after January 2026? This is a critical question for anyone hoping for full accountability. The official answer from the Department of Justice is no. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stated that the January 30th, 2026 release represents the final batch. The DOJ considers its obligations under the Epstein Files Transparency Act fulfilled. But that official answer is already being challenged. Multiple members of Congress, particularly Democrats, have called for continued releases and independent review of withheld materials. Representative Jamie Raskin's January 31st, 2026 letter requesting urgent review of unredacted files in DOJ possession suggests legislative pressure will continue. Other lawmakers have indicated they may push for additional legislation or oversight to force further disclosure. Survivors and their attorneys are also demanding more. After the privacy breach that left victim names exposed, lawyers representing Epstein survivors have filed motions asking federal courts to order the DOJ to take down the current website and conduct a proper review. This legal action could potentially lead to both removal of improperly released victim information and demands for release of improperly withheld documents. If courts get involved, we could see additional waves of disclosure ordered by judges rather than released voluntarily by the DOJ. There's also the question of state investigations. While the federal cases against Epstein and Maxwell have concluded, various state and local jurisdictions continue their own inquiries. Florida authorities, New Mexico investigators, and others have their own files that may eventually become public through state public records laws or additional transparency legislation. These state-level files might contain information that complements or contradicts what's in the federal release. International implications also matter. Epstein had properties and alleged activities in the U.S., Virgin Islands, France, and other jurisdictions. Foreign governments may have their own investigative files. The political pressure on Prince Andrew in the United Kingdom, for example, could lead to additional disclosures from British authorities about what they knew and when. Peter Mandelson's resignation and the Slovakia National Security Advisor's departure show that international political consequences are forcing a reckoning beyond U.S. borders. Then there's the possibility of leaks. With 3.5 million pages now public and millions more in government hands, the likelihood of unauthorized disclosures is real. Whistleblowers, hackers, or disgruntled officials might decide to release materials the government wants to keep hidden. We've seen this pattern with other major document releases throughout history. Once information exists in multiple hands, controlling it becomes extremely difficult. There's also ongoing litigation unrelated to the criminal cases. Civil lawsuits filed by survivors against Epstein's estate and potentially other defendants continue. Discovery in these civil cases could surface additional documents, depositions, and evidence. While civil court documents often have protective orders limiting public access, some materials inevitably become public, either through court filings or media reporting. The passage of time may also lead to further releases. As years pass and people involved die or leave public life, the political sensitivity of certain disclosures may diminish. Documents considered too hot to release in 2026 might become releasable in 2030 or 2035. Historical precedent suggests that controversial government files often see additional releases decades after the events in question. Technology could play a role too. As artificial intelligence and data analysis tools become more sophisticated, researchers may be able to extract new insights from the already released materials, identifying patterns or connections that weren't immediately obvious. This could generate public pressure for release of specific additional documents that would clarify or complete the picture. So while the official answer is no more releases are planned, the realistic answer is more complicated. Additional disclosures are likely, whether through legislative pressure, court orders, international investigations, leaks, civil litigation, or the passage of time. The Epstein Files story is far from over. The January 2026 release was a major chapter, but it's not the final one. The question isn't really whether more will come out, it's when and through what mechanism. For anyone hoping the Epstein Files would provide complete closure and full accountability, the answer is disappointing. We're getting incremental disclosures, partial truths, and continued controversy. But this is often how transparency works with powerful interests at stake. It's not a single revelation, but a long process of pressure, release, analysis, and demands for more. The fight for the full truth about Jeffrey Epstein and his network will continue for years to come. What is the difference between Epstein's Black Book and the Epstein Files? This is an important distinction that often gets confused in media coverage and public discussion. Let me break down what each is and how they relate to each other. Epstein's Black Book is a specific document. It's a contact directory that was seized from Epstein's properties during various investigations. The book contains names, phone numbers, email addresses, and other contact information for over 1,000 people. This includes celebrities, politicians, scientists, business executives, socialites, and others in Epstein's network. The Black Book became public in earlier leaks and court filings well before the January 2026 file release. You can think of it as Epstein's Rolodex, a compilation of everyone he knew or wanted to be able to reach. Being in the Black Book means Epstein had your contact information. It doesn't mean you were involved in his crimes, visited his properties, or even knew him well. Some people in the Black Book had significant relationships with Epstein. Others barely knew him and were surprised to learn they were in his contacts. The Black Book has been analyzed extensively by journalists and researchers. It's organized by categories and includes multiple phone numbers for many individuals, home numbers, office numbers, cell phones, even the contact information for employees and assistants. Some entries have notations or codes whose meanings remain unclear, but fundamentally, the Black Book is a contact list, not an evidence file. The Epstein Files, by contrast, are the comprehensive investigative records compiled by federal law enforcement. These files include the Black Book as one piece of evidence among millions of pages, but they go far beyond contact information. The files contain witness statements, victim testimonies, financial analysis, surveillance footage, emails, text messages, flight logs, real estate records, forensic computer analysis, and much more. Here's an analogy. If the Black Book is like finding someone's phone contacts, the Epstein Files are like reading the FBI's entire investigation report, including phone records showing who actually called whom, when, and what they discussed. The Black Book tells you who Epstein knew. The files tell you what Epstein did, who was involved, and what evidence exists. Flight logs are another specific subset of evidence within the broader files. These logs show passenger manifests for Epstein's private jets, including dates, routes, and names of people who flew. The logs have been particularly significant because they can place specific individuals at specific locations at specific times. If flight logs show someone flew to Epstein's private island on certain dates, and witnesses testified to events on those dates, you can start to build a timeline and potentially corroborate allegations. But like the Black Book, flight logs require context. Flying on Epstein's plane doesn't automatically mean someone knew about or participated in crimes. Some flights were for legitimate purposes, humanitarian missions, business trips, or travel that happened to use Epstein's aircraft. Other flights are far more suspicious, particularly those involving minors or trips to properties where abuse is known to have occurred. The distinction matters enormously for understanding who might be culpable versus who was simply in Epstein's extended network. Financial records in the files show the flow of money, who paid Epstein, who Epstein paid, how money moved through various accounts and shell companies. These records can reveal business relationships, payments to victims, and potentially evidence of money laundering or other financial crimes. But again, a wire transfer to or from Epstein doesn't automatically mean criminal activity. Context and corroborating evidence are essential. Emails and text messages in the files provide the most direct evidence of relationships and knowledge. These communications show what people said to Epstein, what he said to them, and what they may have known about his activities. An email proposing to visit Epstein's island is more significant than just being in his black book. A text message discussing young women is more problematic than simply having flown on his plane once. The communications provide intent and knowledge that contact information alone cannot. Photos and videos, as we discussed earlier, provide visual evidence of who Epstein spent time with, where they went, and what environments they were in. A photo of someone at a charity event with Epstein means less than a photo of someone at a private party on his island with young women present. The visual evidence must be interpreted carefully, but provides confirmation that documentary evidence alone might lack. So to directly answer the question, the Black Book is a single document, a contact list that's one piece of evidence within the much larger Epstein Files. The files are the complete investigative record, including the Black Book, but also flight logs, financial records, emails, photos, videos, witness statements, and forensic analysis. Conflating the two causes confusion. When people say someone is in the Epstein Files, it's important to ask, in what capacity? Are they just in the Black Book? Did they fly on the plane? Are there emails, photos? What's the actual evidence? This distinction is crucial for fair analysis. Being in the Black Book might mean very little. Being in multiple categories of evidence, emails, plus flight logs, plus photos, plus witness statements, creates a very different picture. The Epstein Files allow us to see not just who knew Epstein, but the nature and extent of those relationships. That's why they're so significant and why full transparency matters. Without the complete files, we can't make informed judgments about who was merely an acquaintance and who might have been complicit. Let's talk about what makes these files so controversial beyond just the famous names. The controversy isn't only about who's in the files, it's about what's been left out, redacted, or withheld, and whether those decisions serve justice or protect the powerful. This goes to the heart of why transparency matters and why so many people remain unsatisfied with the January 2026 release. Start with the numbers. 6 million pages identified, 3.5 million released. That's a 50% withholding rate. Is that justified? The Department of Justice says yes. They claim the withheld materials are duplicates, privileged communications, depictions of abuse, or unrelated documents. But critics point out that 50% is an extraordinarily high proportion to withhold, especially given the overwhelming congressional mandate for transparency. Representative Jamie Raskin noted in his letter that when half the identified material is withheld, the public deserves a detailed explanation of why each category was excluded and how those decisions were made. Then there's the redaction issue. Even in the released files, extensive redactions appear throughout. Names are blacked out, paragraphs are removed, sometimes entire pages are redacted with just a header visible. The government says these redactions protect privacy, ongoing investigations, and national security. But which investigations are ongoing? What national security interests are at stake, and whose privacy is being protected? These questions remain largely unanswered. The victim's privacy breach makes the redaction controversy even worse. The DOJ claimed they carefully reviewed materials to protect victim identities. They even had U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton certify that no victim identifying information would be released unredacted. Yet survivors' names appear throughout the released files. Gloria Allred, who represents 27 Epstein survivors, publicly stated the DOJ failed to redact her clients' names. If they got that fundamental protection wrong, what else did they get wrong? Were materials that should have been released instead withheld? Were redactions applied to protect reputations rather than legitimate interests? The timing of the release also raises questions. The law required release by December 19, 2025. The files came out January 30th, 2026, 42 days late. Why? The administration says the delay was necessary to properly review millions of pages. But critics note that the DOJ had the 30 days specified in the law plus years of prior investigation to prepare. The delay looks like foot dragging, an attempt to push the release past the holiday news cycle when public attention would be lower or time to conduct more aggressive redactions than originally planned. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche's role adds another layer of controversy. Blanche was President Trump's personal defense attorney in 2024. Less than a year later, he's the Deputy Attorney General overseeing the release of files that include allegations about Trump. Is that a conflict of interest? The administration says no. Blanche is a qualified prosecutor doing his job. Critics say it's inappropriate for Trump's former lawyer to be managing the release of documents about Trump's relationship with Epstein. At minimum, it creates an appearance of impropriety that undermines public confidence in the process. The content of what was released also matters. The DOJ specifically noted that some materials in the files are fake or falsely submitted. They said untrue and sensationalist claims against President Trump were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. This raises important questions. How much of the released material is false? What verification did the DOJ do? Are false allegations about other people also in the files? By releasing unverified material mixed with genuine evidence, has the DOJ created a situation where anyone can dismiss inconvenient documents as fake? Then there's the question of what's conspicuously absent. Multiple witnesses and survivors have spoken publicly about seeing specific famous people at Epstein's properties, yet some of those names appear to be missing from the released files or heavily redacted when they do appear. Why? Is it because the evidence doesn't support the witnesses' accounts, or because powerful interests have ensured their names are protected? Without access to the withheld materials, we can't know. The international dimension is also controversial. Epstein had properties in multiple countries. He had relationships with foreign nationals, including royalty and government officials. Yet the U.S. files focus primarily on domestic aspects of the investigations. What about French authorities who investigated Epstein's Paris apartment? What about the U.S. Virgin Islands case? What about potential international trafficking? The U.S. files may be incomplete simply because they don't include foreign investigative materials that would provide a fuller picture. Financial records are another area of concern. Epstein's wealth came from somewhere, though his exact business model remains murky. He claimed to manage money for billionaires, but few have acknowledged being his clients. The files contain financial records, but are they complete? Have offshore accounts been fully investigated? What about shell companies and trusts? Financial transparency advocates argue that following the money could reveal much more about Epstein's operations and who benefited from them, but the released financial documents appear heavily redacted and incomplete. The most fundamental controversy is this: who decides what the public gets to see? The Epstein Files Transparency Act was passed with near unanimous support specifically because Congress didn't trust the executive branch to make these decisions fairly. Yet the executive branch still controlled the release, decided what to withhold, and applied redactions according to their own judgment. The spirit of the Transparency Act was to remove discretion. The implementation gave wide discretion back to the very officials Congress didn't trust. This is why many observers remain unsatisfied. Yes, 3.5 million pages is an enormous release. Yes, it reveals significant information about Epstein's network, but it's incomplete, heavily redacted, released late, managed by politically connected officials, and mixed with acknowledged false information. That combination of factors makes it very difficult to have confidence that full transparency has been achieved. And without full transparency, questions about who's being protected and why will persist indefinitely. Let's step back from the specific details and ask a larger question. What do the Epstein files reveal about power, accountability, and justice in America? Because this case is about far more than one criminal and his network. It's about systemic issues that the files expose, often inadvertently. Jeffrey Epstein was able to abuse dozens of victims over decades while maintaining relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world. How did that happen? The files provide disturbing answers. First, wealth buys access and protection. Epstein's fortune, however he acquired it, gave him entry to elite circles. He donated to universities, funded scientific research, hosted intellectual salons, and cultivated relationships with influential people. This network of connections created a protective shield. When allegations first emerged, powerful people didn't want to believe their friend and benefactor was capable of such crimes. Some may have actively defended him. Others simply didn't look too closely. Wealth doesn't just buy lawyers and PR firms, it buys the benefit of the doubt. Second, the files reveal how institutions failed. Law enforcement agencies had information about Epstein's activities for years before his 2008 conviction. That conviction itself resulted in an absurdly lenient sentence through a plea deal that has been called one of the worst miscarriages of justice in modern American legal history. Federal prosecutor Alexander Acosta, who approved that deal, later became Trump's Secretary of Labor before resigning amid controversy over his handling of the Epstein case. The files show that institutional failures weren't just about one rogue prosecutor. Multiple agencies at multiple levels had opportunities to stop Epstein earlier and didn't. Third, the files reveal the power of silence and complicity. Many people knew or suspected something was wrong with Epstein's behavior, particularly his constant presence with very young women. But speaking up against someone powerful and well-connected carries risks. You might be dismissed, sued, socially ostracized, or worse. The files contain statements from people who witnessed inappropriate behavior but didn't report it, or did report it and were ignored. This creates a culture where predators can operate openly because no one with knowledge is willing or able to stop them. Fourth, victim credibility remains a profound problem. The files show that when victims came forward, they often weren't believed or were blamed for their own victimization. Some were paid to stay silent, others were intimidated. The legal system and society at large struggled to accept that wealthy, charitable, well-connected men could also be predators. We're seeing this pattern change slowly, but the Epstein case exposes how deeply embedded the problem remains. Fifth, the files reveal the limits of accountability even when crimes are exposed. Epstein is dead, Maxwell is in prison, but the network that enabled them largely remains untouched. No one else has been charged based on these files. The powerful people who associated with Epstein face public scrutiny and embarrassment, but not legal consequences. This raises fundamental questions about whether justice is possible when crimes involve the elite. Are there really two systems of justice, one for ordinary people and one for the powerful? Sixth, the role of media and conspiracy theories becomes apparent. The Epstein case has spawned countless conspiracy theories, some grounded in legitimate questions, others wildly speculative. The files both help and hurt efforts to find truth. They provide evidence that counters some conspiracies while leaving enough gaps for others to flourish. In an age of information overload and deep distrust of institutions, making sense of millions of pages of complex legal documents is beyond most people's capacity. This creates space for manipulation, whether by conspiracy theorists or by those trying to spin the narrative their preferred way. Seventh, international dimensions matter more than we often acknowledge. Epstein's network was global. He had properties on multiple continents. His associates include foreign royalty, diplomats, and business leaders. Yet American files alone can't capture this international scope. We need cooperation between countries, willingness to pursue justice across borders, and recognition that elite criminal networks don't respect national boundaries. The resignations in Slovakia and UK demonstrate that Epstein's impact reaches far beyond America, but accountability efforts remain frustratingly national in scope. Eighth, the files reveal the challenge of historical reckoning. Many of Epstein's associations were decades ago, before his crimes were publicly known. How do we fairly evaluate people's decisions to associate with him when they may not have known what he was? This is complicated by the fact that some people clearly knew or should have known, while others were genuinely deceived. The files don't always make these distinctions clear, leaving us to judge based on incomplete information. Finally, the Epstein files force us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to accept from powerful people. If someone is brilliant, creative, wealthy, or politically useful, how much bad behavior are we willing to overlook? The files show that Epstein's behavior raised red flags for years, but those flags were ignored because he was useful to people, he funded research, he made connections, he donated money, and so people looked the other way. This isn't unique to Epstein, it's a pattern that repeats across industries, institutions, and eras. These broader implications matter because they show us the Epstein case isn't an isolated horror story. It's a symptom of systemic problems in how power operates, how justice functions, and how societies protect the vulnerable or fail to. The files are evidence not just of Epstein's crimes, but of the environment that enabled them. Real accountability would require addressing these systemic issues, not just punishing individual criminals after the fact. Whether we have the collective will to do that remains very much an open question. So after examining 3.5 million pages, thousands of videos, hundreds of thousands of images, and all the controversy surrounding their release, where does that leave us? What do we actually know about the Epstein files and the scandal they document? Let's summarize clearly and honestly. What we know, Jeffrey Epstein was a serial sexual predator who trafficked and abused dozens of underage girls over many years. Ghislaine Maxwell helped him recruit and groom victims. Epstein cultivated relationships with powerful people across politics, business, science, and entertainment. He used his wealth and connections to gain access to elite circles and to avoid serious consequences for his behavior for far too long. When he was finally charged with federal crimes in 2019, he died in custody before trial. The investigations into his activities generated millions of pages of evidence. We know that the U.S. Congress, responding to public pressure, passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. We know the Department of Justice released approximately half of the identified materials, including 3.5 million pages, over 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. We know these files name numerous prominent individuals and document their various connections to Epstein. We know that appearing in the files doesn't equal criminal guilt. Most people named haven't been charged with crimes. We know that prosecutors have stated the released files don't provide sufficient evidence for new prosecutions beyond those already completed. We know that some people named in the files have faced political consequences, including resignations, even without criminal charges. We also know what we don't know. We don't know what's in the roughly 3 million pages that were withheld. We don't know whether redactions were applied appropriately or whether they're protecting powerful interests. We don't know the full extent of Epstein's network or everyone who may have participated in or enabled his crimes. We don't know how Epstein really made his money or who his actual clients were. We don't know all the details of his death and why security protocols failed so catastrophically. We don't know whether justice has truly been served. Epstein is dead. Maxwell is in prison. But for many survivors and advocates, that's not enough. They want accountability for everyone involved, transparency about how institutions failed, and systemic changes to prevent similar cases in the future. We don't yet know if those broader goals will be achieved. What comes next? The legal fight over additional disclosures will continue. Congressional oversight will pressure the DOJ to release more materials or explain what's been withheld. Survivors' attorneys will push for courts to review redaction decisions and protect victim privacy that was violated in the release. International investigations may surface additional information from foreign jurisdictions. Civil litigation will continue, potentially revealing more through discovery processes. Journalists and researchers will spend years analyzing the released materials, finding connections and patterns that aren't immediately obvious. Books will be written, documentaries will be produced, academic studies will examine how this case unfolded and what it reveals about power and justice. Some questions may never be fully answered. Some documents may remain classified for decades. Some powerful people may take their secrets to the grave, but the pressure for truth and accountability won't disappear. Each new disclosure, whether official or leaked, will reignite public interest and demand for answers. For survivors, the release of these files is deeply complicated. Some feel vindicated that the scale of Epstein's crimes and network is finally being publicly acknowledged. Others feel re-traumatized, especially those whose names were improperly exposed. All deserve justice, privacy, and support, things the system has too often failed to provide. For the public, the Epstein files serve as a test of whether powerful institutions can police themselves and whether transparency is real or just a word politicians use. The disappointing reality is that we got partial transparency, limited accountability, and many unanswered questions. That's better than nothing, but it's far from the full reckoning many hoped for. The Epstein case will remain a defining scandal for this era, not just because of the horrific crimes at its center, but because of what it reveals about the world those crimes occurred in. A world where wealth and connections can shield predators for years, where institutions repeatedly fail the vulnerable, where even overwhelming evidence and public outcry don't always lead to full accountability, and where the truth emerges slowly, incompletely, and over strong resistance from those who would prefer it stayed hidden. The files are now public, or at least partially so. What we do with that information, whether we demand better, whether we push for systemic change, and whether we truly hold the powerful accountable, that's up to all of us. The Epstein files aren't just a historical document. They're a challenge. Will we accept the incomplete version of truth we've been given, or will we keep demanding more until justice is actually served? That's the question these files leave us with. And the answer will determine whether this scandal leads to meaningful change or just becomes another chapter in a long history of powerful people escaping consequences while victims and the public are left with disappointment and doubt. The Epstein files have been released, but the fight over what they mean, what comes next, and whether justice will truly be done is far from over.